Unemployment, bankruptcy, homelessness, a global economic crisis. Should we be optimistic or pessimistic about our global economic recovery? Exploring the impact and seeking solutions, United Nations University presents UNU Conversations, the Economic Crisis.
So welcome to this edition of the UNU Conversation series on the financial crisis, organized in connection with the June 2009 UN Conference on the World Financial and Economic Crisis and its impact on development. I am Jean-Marc Coicaud from the United Nations University. And with us here today, we have Mr. François Bourguignon, who is director of the Paris School of Economics. Mr. Bourguignon is also a former chief economist and senior vice president at the World Bank. And Mr. Bourguignon is here with us today to talk about the impacts of the recent financial crisis still unfolding, so the impact of this crisis on the European Union. So just to begin the conversation, Mr. Bourguignon, which countries were the first to start feeling the strains of the crisis in Europe?
It seems to be quite clear that the first country was the United Kingdom. As a matter of fact, they started very early with the crisis, although at that time people didn't realize that there was a crisis in the making. But you may remember that the difficulty with the Northern Rock Bank really started at the end of 2007. So it was really one of the first signs that there was something wrong. And the difficulty of the Northern Rock Bank was precisely the fact that this bank had practiced the system of subprimes. It had a lot of subprimes in its assets, and when the bubble on the housing started to burst, many people were not able to reimburse their mortgage, and then the unfolding of this financial crisis started. So it is quite clear that UK, first because of the housing bubble, and second because there were a high proportion of subprime in the total mortgage, which were in the banking system, was the first to be hit by the crisis. But then it spread to other countries. Of course, countries where you had the same kind of housing bubble, Ireland, which was very severely hit, Spain, which was also very severely hit, but in the latter case, in the case of Spain, this didn't combine with the issue of the subprimes. And then I would say that for the other European countries, the crisis really hit them more or less as a contagion of the crisis in the US, but it was not a direct shock as in the case of United Kingdom and Ireland.
In France, has it been a major issue? I mean, and how did it manifest itself?
No, in France, for example, and I think it would be the same thing in Germany, initially the problem was with the banking system, not so much because banks were heavily involved in collateral debt obligations, CDOs or subprimes, but because many banks were exposed to this kind of asset, which had been disseminated in the whole financial system, in all financial markets, by US banks and by British banks. So banks like the Dresdner Bank, a bank like Société Générale and others were hit not so much because they had done or they had given a subprime mortgage, but basically because they had assets which were based on those derivatives. And when those derivatives started to go down in terms of price, then all when the initial subprime started to go down, then all the derivatives went down and the banks were severely affected. And this was really the beginning of the crisis. And then I would say that it has been a typical contagion in the sense that the price of all the stocks in stock markets went down, and then given the system of mark-to-market evaluation of the capital of the asset of any financial institution, then those banks had to restrict credit, and then this started to spread to the real sector of the economy, and this is what has been going on. It is a way in which the financial hit or the financial shock in the US, in the UK, finally reached continental Europe.
You just talked about the stock market and the drop in prices. I mean, but I mean, it seems to me that I mean, what's the question that I'm going to ask you? Is the market as important in Europe as it is in America, and does it play the same function?
No, the market is extremely important. I mean, is it as important as in America? I would say yes. I mean, over time, it is true that historically, continental Europe had a financial system which was quite different from the financial system in Anglo-Saxon countries. It was more bank-based in continental Europe and more market-based in Anglo-Saxon countries. With time, those differences are really tending to disappear, and because of that, the European financial system was hit, although much less than at the center by the crisis in the US and in the UK. But we must insist on the fact that it was a kind of indirect effect rather than a direct effect. And then what we have to keep in mind is that because in all countries the financial shock had an impact on the real economy, started to have an impact on the real economy, then we have been in a situation where the financial shock fed the real economy shock, which in turn fed the financial difficulties of the bank, and this is a way in which we got into this major crisis we are in. But maybe I would like to add something which I think is important, which is the fact that we cannot say that all the problems that European countries are facing today are all due to the financial crisis, all due to this unfolding of the crisis. Some of the problems were structural. I mean, when we talk, for example, of the automotive industry and the fact that very quickly this sector was in big trouble, we cannot say that this is essentially the result of the financial crisis. Those problems pre-existed to the crisis. They became more acute because of the crisis, but we cannot hide the fact that there is a need for structural adjustment in European countries, and the crisis to some extent magnified the need for this adjustment.
Mm-hmm. So precisely the crisis is striking. So what have been the measures taken by the European Union, but also individually by the countries as a way to address this crisis? And do you think that these measures which have been taken, are going to be also used as a way to address these kind of structural problems you just alluded to?
No, I believe that the treatment of the crisis by European countries and by the European Union. I think it is more important to talk about the European Union in these circumstances, had some problems, basically because we not discovered, we knew it, but we could realize that the European Union, and in particular the eurozone, was not completely equipped to deal with this kind of crisis. So we had a response by the European Central Bank, which was okay in the sense that the European Central Bank realized immediately that there would be a need for more liquidity in the system. They provided the liquidity that was needed in order to prevent as much as possible some kind of a credit crunch situation. They progressively, although a little less rapidly than in the US and in the UK, they reduced the rate of interest. So from that point of view, I think that they did their job. We can discuss whether the timing was a perfect timing, but at the end of the day, they did the job which they were expected to do. The problem really came from the other side, and the fact that there is no centralized fiscal policy in Europe, because the European Commission control only a very, very, very small part of the total budget of the countries which belong to the Union and of the countries which belong to the eurozone, which means that from that point of view, the approach to the crisis or the response to the crisis was essentially country-based, and this is where I believe that we have witnessed a problem of coordination. When the European Commission said rather early a fiscal stimulus, a major fiscal stimulus will be needed in order to avoid the crisis to have effects which would be too large, then countries were rather timid to get into deciding about fiscal stimulus plans. You may remember that at the beginning of the crisis, Germany, for example, said, we are not that keen in getting into increasing the budget deficit. It took us some time to rebuild a budget that is in equilibrium. We don't want to jeopardize all these efforts because of the crisis. Then, a couple of months later, they realized that this was absolutely necessary. In the case of France, I think that there was a will to go ahead and to do some kind of fiscal stimulus, but then the difficulty was that in France and in other countries in Europe, the public debt was already very high, which meant that there was not very much space for adding to spending. And because of that, it took a lot of time before all the countries, not all, but most important European countries got in the fiscal stimulus. And now it has been the case. You know that on average, the estimation is that European countries devoted 1.3% of GDP to the fiscal stimulus. This is less than in the US, this is less than in China, but yet this is something substantial.
So in essence, you think that a bigger stimulus would be required for the things to go again, and because, I mean, if I understand you correctly, because of a lack of centralized fiscal policy, it hasn't happened, and you see it as one of the weaknesses, structural weaknesses of the eurozone, right?
Yeah, I think that this has shown that there was a weakness in the eurozone, which was this capacity to react quickly to this kind of crisis situation, and not only to have the correct monetary management with the European Central Bank, but to have the correct fiscal management. The problem being that there is no fiscal authority at the level of the EU.
And also, how do you handle this problem? Because I mean, the situations of countries vary greatly. You know, France has, I think, very significant public debt, which is not necessarily the case of Germany. So, how do you harmonize these situations, and how do you create this centralized fiscal policy due to lack of institutional authority? How do you go about this problem?
For the moment, I have no magic bullet. I would like to have one, but when this crisis will be over, when we will be recovering or will be in our way to recover from the crisis, I believe that this is an issue that the European Union, the European community in the true sense of this word, will have to think about. It will have been clear from the crisis that this instrument was missing, and then we'll have to decide about how to go in the future. There's been big progress in the construction of the European Union, and certainly the common currency was a big progress. You may remember that at some stage, at the beginning of the crisis, some people were even saying that the euro was at risk, and that it would be not possible for the the eurozone to go through the crisis without running the risk of simply dismantling the euro system. Now, I'm not saying that we're out of the woods. We're still in maybe at the time of the crisis where there is a deceleration in the worsening of the situation. So we are not yet at the time where there may be a recovery, but we have to observe that the euro has never been really in trouble, has never been at risk, despite what people were saying. Now, what we discovered with the crisis, and again, it's not a discovery, we knew it before, but what this crisis made clear, and I hope that politicians and the whole civil society will have understood that lesson, was that we were missing some kind of centralized fiscal policy. Now, behind that, issues are really incredibly difficult, because you can see that it was already difficult to go toward the euro, to have this common currency, and for many countries simply to give up their monetary policy power. Now, what we would have to do is to ask some countries to give up their fiscal policy power and to have part of their expenditures to some extent controlled or at least monitored by the central unit, which presumably would be in Brussels.
But for you, it's one of the key lessons of the crisis when it comes to the state of the European Union and what needs to be done for the future. So in essence, you're also saying that the European Central Bank at the moment doesn't have much flexibility and way to really respond in an agile manner to such a crisis.
No, I mean, I think that what they did was correct, and they could not do much more than that. I mean, there is another issue that you have to take into account, which is that when you're comparing the European system and the US system, in the US you have the Federal Reserve Board, and the Federal Reserve Board has some say into the way in which the banking system is regulated. Now, in the case of Europe, it is not that clear. When we discussed about bailing out some financial institutions, some banks, the issue was not so much with the European Central Bank. The issue was an issue of national governments. And again, this is something which is slightly different from what may be observed in the US. So again, I mean, it is completely natural to find that in such situations, we realize the weaknesses of the governance system that we are living with. Now, my fear is that finally this crisis will go through. Finally, because to a large extent I believe that it has been managed rather well. People reacted, responded in an adequate way. It could have been better, but they responded adequately. The drop in income, let's hope that what we observe today is more or less the bottom of the crisis. The drop in income will have not been as bad as in the 30s. And then my fear is that because of that, in 2 or 3 years' time, people will say, finally, we went through that crisis. It was not that bad after all, which means that we don't need to go beyond where we were in terms of economic policy integration within Europe. And my personal belief is that, yes, we need to go beyond that.
Yeah. But still, I mean, unemployment is rising in Europe, I mean, in France, in Spain, and so on. So, and you know, how long is it going for how long is it going to continue? It's difficult to know, but I mean, you know, it's a real problem. And do you feel that had we had a bigger stimulus package, we would have been able to really tame the effect of the crisis from a social point of view? In other words, I mean, what is the cost that we are paying for having, in your view, too small, perhaps, a stimulus package?
No, it is true that unemployment keeps going up, And I'm afraid that it will keep going up for quite some time, because we know that there is a lag between the implementation of a fiscal stimulus and the impact of that stimulus on the level of economic activity and on the level of employment. We also have to remember that in many cases, the increase in unemployment is really the combination of two phenomena. One is a drop in economic activity, and the other one is structural adjustment. And some companies taking advantage of that circumstance to modify, to restructure their activity and to say, this is not because of my strategy, this is because of the crisis. So we must be aware of the fact that in the increase in unemployment, there are really two components, one which is truly cyclical and the other one which is more structural. But from that point of view, it is clear that a quicker response and a more massive response probably would have done better in terms of unemployment. But I believe that the impact of the existing package on unemployment will show up sometime before the end of the year. We observe that the job destruction is slowing down. Then we have to hope that we will reach the point where job destruction will be completely equilibrated by job creation. But in any case, it is clear that in a country like France, we will go beyond 10% unemployment rate, something which we thought was something which belonged to the past. So there is no doubt about the fact that there is a problem of unemployment. But I would like also to insist on another component of the European economies, which is the presence of a rather effective safety net, social safety net in those countries, which means that I'm not saying that unemployment is not a problem because we have rather generous unemployment benefits compared to other countries in the world. Unemployment is bad per se, and it is something which has to be avoided, but it is some compensation to be able to rely on these unemployment benefits. And in turn, those unemployment benefits contribute to stimulating the whole economy. Because if those people could not rely on unemployment benefit, then the final demand for consumption goods within the economy would fall much more than it has been the case. So this is what economists call automatic stabilizers, and they have played a huge role in equilibrating, in compensating the drop in economic activity. In the case of France and Germany, for example, the estimate is that over the last year, more or less, the automatic stabilizers have provided a fiscal stimulus which is close to 1% of GDP. So it is almost the same size as the official, as the additional spending which was decided by the government.
So, but I mean, is it? These automatic stabilizers, are they sustainable? And also, over the years, you have written a lot on issues of equity, efficiency, inequality. And so, is the situation, from your point of view, satisfying, what is required in terms of efficiency and equity?
Okay. In terms of efficiency, it's very difficult to say that an economy which is shrinking is an efficient economy, okay? Basically, it is an inefficient economy, and what we have to do is to make sure that we will be able to go in the opposite direction as quickly as possible. So I'm not sure that efficiency is really what we should be talking about. In terms of equality, we know that those safety nets permit to avoid this kind of crisis, to cause too many problems in terms of inequality, in terms of inequality at the bottom of the distribution. People are hurt, but they are not hurt disproportionately with respect to the rest of the population. So it is not completely clear that inequality is really increasing because of the crisis, but I would say that very much would depend on what is going on at the other side of the distribution, at the top of the distribution. And then there's been a lot of discussion about those huge golden parachutes, those huge bonuses being paid to CEOs, to traders, etc. And I would say that the inequality issue is more on that side, and the fact that we would like to make sure that the cost of the crisis is shared by everybody more or less in the same proportion in the economy, and this may not be the case when we look at the top of the economy.
Yes, because in fact one of the underlying theme of this whole economic crisis is how do we dovetail the quest for economic efficiency with the quest for economic or social justice. I mean, it seems to be the graal of modern economics. So, and it's part of the debate having to do between the Americans and the Europeans. I mean, how do we dovetail these two things? So, in your view, what could be part of the solution at least?
No, again, I mean, I don't think that we should look at an economy in crisis times to make judgment on whether this economy is egalitarian, inegalitarian, efficient, non-efficient. I believe that what we have to think about is, and this is what you said a little earlier, what we have to think about is the way in which we will get out of the crisis. How long will it take? What will we have learned from the crisis, and whether we will be in a more efficient and a more equitable, sustainable state of the economy after the crisis. Now, from that point of view, it is certainly the case that the recovery, I believe, it will be slow. It will be slow because in many countries the public debt will be very high, and there will be a need to adjust the public debt, which means that there will be a need to increase taxes, not to allow final demand to grow as quickly as it could do without this necessary adjustment of the debt to GDP ratio. But at the same time, we must make sure that in terms of employment, in terms of the distribution of income, the new regime or the regime that will settle when we will be recovering is something which is satisfactory. I would say that in Europe we have the forces which will push in that direction, but again, I'm not sure that we can really focus only on what is going on today as to judge about all these issues of equity. The most important thing for today is to avoid poor people, vulnerable groups, to be hit and in a permanent way by the crisis. I'm not saying that we completely succeeded. Certainly there are people who fell through the cracks, but I would say that in Europe, the safety nets are efficient or effective, more exactly, enough to have produced this kind of result.
So in the European context, I mean, which countries are in particular do you see leading the charge, so to speak, for the region's recovery from the crisis? Is it Germany? Is it France? Is it other countries? I mean, who is...
I would say that as a kind of a paradox, probably I would say that Germany is the country that will lead the recovery for one very simple reason. You know that Germany is the country which is most affected by the crisis. It is expected that GDP will go down in Germany by some 6% in 2009, but it is expected that the growth rate might become positive again in Germany in 2010. And the reason for that is that Germany has been very severely hit because the global crisis reduced enormously international trade, and we know that Germany is a major world exporter of manufactured goods, so they were directly affected by the hit on the global economy. But the reverse will be that the day the global economy will start to recover, and we have some signs of that in emerging countries, in China, in India, we can see that the rate of growth in 2009 will not be as low as what was expected. Then a country like Germany will be able to take advantage of this recovery of emerging countries much more easily and much more quickly than other countries in Europe, which are not so much on the manufacturing export side. So my view would be that Germany probably will be out of the woods will be among the first countries to be out of the woods. Probably UK might be in the same situation for completely different reasons, yes, because they got into the crisis earlier than the others, because they can rely on another instrument which is not available in the eurozone, which was a devaluation of their currency with respect to the euro, which is an instrument which could not be used. And as a matter of fact, it is the opposite. The euro has been appreciating with respect to the dollar. So this is something, one of the reasons why I believe that the UK may also recover a little earlier than other countries. But we have to realize that there is such a complementarity among European countries that it is likely that when one or two countries, major countries like Germany or the UK, will start recovering, then the rest of the countries will follow. Except maybe for one part of Europe, which is the new EU members, which is Eastern Europe, the Baltic countries, where we know that they have major financial problems, and it is not clear that those financial problems will all be solved very quickly. They still have adjustments to make so that they can get back to a sustainable growth path, and for them, I would say that it will take longer than for the other countries.
What about France?
France has been, in comparison with Germany, less affected by the crisis. We expect the GDP to fall by a little more than 3% in 2009, and to fall again in 2010, maybe by 0.2% or something like that. Definitely, I don't think that France is a country which can be a kind of leader in the recovery. It is true, and it has been presented as a country which was less affected than others, and many people, many commentators refer to the French model, saying, okay, look, France finally is less affected than other countries because the financial sector was not so exposed to the same risk as in other countries, because they have this very effective safety net, and because of that, they will do better than the others. I find that this analysis is a little too optimistic. If we have a drop of 3% of GDP, after all, this is more or less what is expected for the United States. It is what is expected for the global economy. So I don't think that we are doing much better than the others. And my expectation is that we will do like the others when the financial system will stabilize, when there will be signs of recovery in the most dynamic countries like Germany, then France will follow. But we may also come back to the point I made before, which is that this crisis took place at a time where we certainly didn't solve all the issues, all the problems which are linked to globalization. We know that there are adjustments which will be necessary in all these economies in Europe due to globalization, due to the fact that there is a switch in the geographical distribution of activities in the world, and it is not because we will be getting out of the crisis that those problems will be over. The problem of the automotive industry, it is not clear at all that the problem will be over. It is true that there will be more demand for new cars, and because of that, the national car producers will do better in France, in Germany, in Italy. But the basic problem, which is, will the production of these cars stay in Europe, or will it be the case that more and more Europe will be the place where the final assembly of the car is taking place, with most of the production taking place elsewhere? This process, which is the process of globalization, is not over. So it may well be the case that we will be out of the crisis, but we will be back to what I would call the initial and old globalization problems, and we will have to tackle them in an effective way.
But precisely, you just talked about Europe and globalization. So as a way to conclude, since we are approaching the end of our conversation, I mean, what kind of role do you envision for Europe in terms of the reconstruction or the reimagination of the global architecture when it comes to finance and economics? And what kind of role do you see for European countries, the European Union, in the upcoming conference, which is going to take place at the end of the month here in New York, on the financial crisis?
No, I believe that Europe has shown with this crisis that it was definitely much more stable in financial terms than other countries in the world, and in particular than the US. At the same time, it has shown that, of course, it was not isolated, not insulated from the rest of the financial system. So maybe because of that, European banks have some importance in the world. We have major players in Europe, and at the end of the day, maybe the crisis will help those major players to be more important, to play a more important role in the global economy. Now, does Europe have something really important to say when the discussion will come back to fundamentals of the future of the global economy? I would say yes, but not so much on current economic issues. We know, and the crisis has made us to some extent forget, that there are major issues that the global economy is facing. In particular, environment is something important. The issue of natural resources is something extraordinarily important. And you know that some people thought that maybe this crisis was a good opportunity to put these issues on the table and maybe to propose a shift in the way in which we would think about the growth of the global economy. And then I would say that if there is a role to be played by Europe when the time will come to discuss about the after crisis, then I would say that this should play, this should rank very high in the priorities of Europe.
So are you saying that in a way we're making too much of a big deal of this crisis, and that we are forgetting to really focus on what is equally, if not more important, in terms of paradigm of growth, factoring in issues of environment, of development, and so on and so on?
Of course, yes. I mean, we had problems. We knew that we were facing problems of sustainability of our growth model before the crisis. Now, the crisis came. We believe, or we hope and we believe that the crisis will be resolved in 1 or 2 year time. But you can see that the expectations of many people is we will be getting back to the old model. Now, the problem is that we are not sure that this old model is the right model. We know that this old model is very detrimental in terms of environment, very detrimental in terms of climate change, that something has to be done. And we know that it is very difficult to take action because at the same time we want something to be done, but we don't want to penalize emerging countries, developing countries, which have to develop and for which there is no reason to impose additional constraints because of the environment. So all these issues are still in front of us, and I would say that very quickly in the process of discussing the after crisis, we should put those issues back on the table.
But it seems to be a difficult predicament because in a way, economic success seems to be based on growth, which is based on demand, and then you have the issue of sustainability. So what would be an alternative model? I mean, how do you get out of this predicament?
No, I mean, the alternative model is, I think, is a simple model. The only thing, what is the problem in the world today, and maybe it was more important before the crisis, and today we are obsessed by the crisis, but these issues are still very important, is the fact that we are consuming too much natural resources and we are emitting too much greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So there is no other way than making sure that the price to be paid for this will increase, that there will be a price being paid for emitting too much CO2 in the atmosphere. Now, you know that there's been discussion, I mean, you know that in Europe, and this is the reason why I think that Europe has an important role to play, that in Europe we have created a market for emission of greenhouse gases, and there was exchanges of emission permits, and there was a price that companies would have to pay if they wanted to emit more CO2 than they were allowed to. So this is like a tax. They have to pay a price, an explicit price, if they want to emit more carbonic gas. Now, the US was not in the agreement. Emerging countries, big emerging countries, were not in the agreement. And we know that it does not make very much sense to have this market or this kind of mechanism working only at the European level, because Europe, although it is a major economic power in the world, it is not the only economic power, and it represents only one part of the production and one part of the greenhouse gas emitter. So I would say that at the time that we will be discussing seriously the exit of the crisis, it is important for Europeans, for the international community, to say, look, we will not get back exactly to the initial model. We will get back to a model where we will be more gentle with respect to the environment, and we'll take that opportunity of having this kind of disruption in the global economy to switch to a kind of new regime.
A final question, perhaps, Professor Bourguignon. A few days ago, Paul Krugman was delivering a lecture at the London School of Economics, and one of the things that he was saying in this lecture is that a very significant part of the work which has been done in the field of macroeconomics in the past 30 years has proved not very useful to understand the crisis. So what does it, I don't know if it's true, but I mean, if it is true, I mean, what does it tell us on the state of the field of economics as a science? I mean, how do we think about this issue?
No, I mean, it is true that there is something which we don't understand in the way in which crises are occurring. And if we knew how they would strike, then we would be able to simply stop them, and there would be no crisis. So certainly there is something that we don't understand. Now, one thing we know is that historically, anytime we are going through a period during which money is very abundant, savings in the world are very abundant, then we know that there is an issue in going from this situation back to a situation where money will be less abundant. If you think about the oil crisis back in the 70s, huge availability of savings because oil-producing countries had to recycle their oil income. Then in all the world, the rates of interest on saving, on investment went down, and we had all those investments taking place with very inefficient rates of return. And a couple of years later, we had the debt crisis, which was, of course, concentrated in emerging countries. And it took us a long time to get out of this debt crisis. What happened this time is something very similar. We had, for several reasons, there was an inflow of savings in the world economy coming from Asian countries, Japan and China, coming from countries which wanted to make sure that they would be insulated from any kind of crisis of the Asian crisis type or the Mexican crisis type or the Argentinian crisis type. Because of that, they accumulated reserves to make sure that they would be insured against this kind of crisis. What did that cause? It caused an inflow, a big increase in world savings, which contributed to lowering the rate of interest. On top of that, you had September 11, the decision by the US to have also a very low rate of interest policy in order to make sure that September 11 would not have any impact on the real economy. So for years, we lived with extremely low rates of interest. Now, what does happen when this is the case? You have a tendency for people to overborrow, so excessive leverage in all the economy, and you have a tendency for people to take too much risk because the risk is not very costly. If you lend at a very low rate, if the investment fails, the cost is not that big. So what happened was exactly that. We were again in a situation where, for several reasons, there was this excess savings in the global economy, and because at the same time there were financial innovations which we didn't control very well, and this is really where, I guess, our mistake, our ignorance really lies. We didn't realize that because of these financial innovations, the adjustment when we would be out of this period of excessive savings, the adjustment would be so violent. And this is exactly what happened. So I plead guilty to some extent. I plead guilty because it is true that we don't realize that those financial innovations were very dangerous, and they were increasing the risk that would come with any kind of correction of the imbalances which had been built during those times of excessive savings. When I was in the World Bank, I remember that every year for the last 2 years, I said, look, the global economy is doing very, very well, but there are risks, there are imbalances in the global economy, and we must be prepared to an adjustment. But what we didn't see with my colleagues, or with my colleagues of the Monetary Fund in those days, we didn't see that the adjustment would be as violent as it has been.
Professor Bourguignon, thank you for all your insights. François Bourguignon is the director of the Paris School of Economics. He's also a former chief economist and senior vice president at the World Bank. I am Jean-Marc Coicaud from the United Nations University. I thank you for watching. And once again, Professor Bourguignon, thank you for sharing your ideas and expertise and insight with us. Thank you.